let me welcome you to the Cybernetics Society annual conference. This is the 52nd annual conference. We spent some months wondering how this conference was going to happen and whether it could be met. We've always met face to face. This is the first time not. And I have to say that there is one great benefit of not meeting face to face. We have, for example, Paul Pangaro in the group here, who is, I believe, designated to become the next president of the ASC. And I imagine he's joining from across the world. We have people joining from Finland, from Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from France, as well as from England, and of course from different parts of the country. So it does facilitate that and therefore create much more of an international conversation. And perhaps also we've seen a much more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary conversation this year, which is really wonderful. There's been quite a focus around design and practice in our end, and a very, very varied, wonderful diet over in America as well, if you've been hopping to and fro. So the program is we have 2 hours here, and then you can go and spend a couple of hours in America. Although you don't actually need to fly over there in order to get there. And then you can come back here for another couple of hours. In this session this morning, we have 3 interesting people. And then in the second session, we have another 3 interesting people. The 3 speakers today are for this session, Markus Orengo, Dr. Marie Davidova. I do hope I've pronounced her name right, but knowing her personality, great. She'll put me right. And then we have Stephen Brewis also speaking. They are very interesting, different people. And it seems to me that one of the great hallmarks of cybernetics as a practice, a discipline, and so on, is that it allows for such varied personalities with such eccentric life paths and such varied interests, because since cybernetics began as a transdisciplinary field that was not based on any other discipline and effectively crossed every other discipline. It can affect physics and biology and architecture and design and sociology and business practice and so on and so on and so on. Then it has this wonderful characteristic that people themselves tend to cross and dance across different boundaries. And the first of our speakers is like that. Markus Orengo began his life quite solidly in the engineering field, electrical engineering, and his path involves a migration from electrical engineering through to, so technical, you could say, from the technical to the socio-technical. And he now has a company which works with social system engineering. He's going to be talking to us, sharing with us his story of practice, his experience in working with organizations around the forming of vision and mission. Vision and mission clearly have a relationship to cybernetics, which he may or may not need to explain, but it's pretty obvious that they form homeostats or purpose, or what you want to call it, something towards which the organization is directed in some way. So how he does that and how it is related to cybernetics, but also in doing so, how he manages to do that without using the language of cybernetics, which I'm certainly interested in looking forward to, because some of the language of cybernetics is very off-putting to managers. And especially as some of the terms like feedback have got contaminated in social circles. So I'm looking forward to hearing Markus.
Yes, I do.
Okay, over to you.
I'd like to make a brief input on how to apply cybernetic principles for formulating better visions and missions, which I take here just as one of management consulting. I'm a management consulting, and I often have to do visions and missions with teams of decision makers. And I try to show how I can do that without mentioning cybernetics. I will also go a bit into depth why I would do that without mentioning cybernetics. First, I'd like to give a brief context. Hold on. So, brief context. So what I assume, and I cannot go into all the details because we have only 20 minutes, this is that we, and with we, I mean in particular the community who is in this conference, the cyberneticians, more or less experts, but everybody who heard about cybernetics, about management cybernetics in particular, everybody who knows the VSM, who knows a little bit in depth about feedback loops and so on. I think there is a consensus. We believe that management cybernetics is a useful tool set to build better organizations. I'm not going into detail what better really means, also due to the 20 minutes, very briefly, that make a societal contribution, that treat their employees well, and so on, and so on. It's about companies, about NGOs, about administration, about entire societies, and so on. A second point I assume at the beginning is that we also have to admit, and I refer here to the presentation we've had yesterday from Martin Pfiffner, we have to admit that this cybernetic tool set or meta tool set, if you want to call it like this, is not used really broadly. We're all convinced that could be more useful, but the majority of managers, of decision makers, they've never heard about these concepts, neither about the VSM nor about other useful things. So the question I like to address in this presentation, what do we have to do in the 21st century? And sometimes this sounds a little bit like the future, but I just like to remember the 21st century is now. What do we have to do to spread this cybernetic tool set to a much larger number of decision makers? So this is the setup of my brief presentation, and I like to split it into three parts. First, I like to give an example. In this example, I would assume that I'm a management consultant, and you, all of you who listen to this presentation, you are managers in a management workshop I'm working with. In the second part, I would briefly highlight the cybernetic principles I used in the background. This is only for a cybernetic audience. I wouldn't explain that to the managers. And in the end, I briefly like to explain why I didn't use cybernetic language in the first part. So let's get into the first part. I'm a management consultant. You are managers of one company or of several companies. And I like to talk to you about how to formulate better visions and missions. Now, all of you may know this pyramid, vision, mission, strategy. And it is a very common concept. It is taught in all business schools, in universities, and so on. It's a classic, like a status-oriented perspective. And it is inspired, obviously, by the org chart, even though that's usually not really mentioned. It is the top management does a vision, and then middle management gets involved in doing missions. A bit further below, strategies are formulated, and so on. Another thing about this pyramid is very often it's geared towards public relations. So the idea is we need to write something on the website for our investors and customers. How do we formulate visions and missions? What I like to do is give an alternative way to do visions and missions. And it starts with the idea that we want to get action oriented. It's not public relation oriented, but it's geared towards individual action of employees. And the concept starts with the insight that without any direction, employees could basically do whatever they want. They could work on what they're interested. They could start to sing together. They could go to the beach. They could do whatever they want. And out of this unlimited room of options, I need to narrow it down. And the first step of narrowing down what to do is I'm formulating a vision. And usually I guide this process with a question: to which world do we want to contribute? And I give you an example out of my own business. In my own business, a consulting business, I say in this vision statement that I believe the world as such is not bad, but it is badly managed. And I believe that better management would lead to a better world. And so I want to contribute in principle to a better managed world. So this involves already something I like to do, but it's also a top-level value statement. I cannot contribute to any kind of world, but it has something to do with a world that is better due to better management. And I may add how I want to be seen by this world, whether I want to be a market leader or just a professional partner in these type of questions, regardless of the size I have, and so on. Next step, I formulate a mission, which is a specific but still general contribution to this world. In the case of my own company, I would say I work with small and medium enterprises, in brackets, not with NGOs, not with administrations, not with worldwide enterprises, but I focus on small and medium enterprises to make better management systems. And this is general contribution, means it's not really, it doesn't really depend on the economic situation, on the larger weather conditions, whether the interest rates are high or low, whether we have a crisis or not. This is reflected by the strategy, which explains how I would implement the mission in the current broader situation, which has all these type of socio-economic parameters that are valid typically in a time frame of like about 5 years. And after the strategy, I would derive projects, management by objective, RACI matrices, and so on. And from that, further down, I would narrow down further the options of the individual employee. Once I will get to daily plans, and at the bottom, I have a happy employee because he knows what the right thing to do is. Behind there, you have an entire body of theory which says that employees, among others, get unhappy if they don't really know what to do, if they don't have orientation. I can further narrow down this funnel of options by formulating values and code of conduct. A strategy, for example, may give me a lot of options. I can have open door policy, I can have closed door policy. If I define in a code of conduct, we in our company, we have an open door policy. This limits the room for maneuver because I exclude the closed door policy. So concluding, I recommend to the managers, first create inwards orientation and only then do the PR based the PR based on this inward orientation. And very often it's done the other way around, and create orientation by defining what you do and also what you don't is usually the more difficult part. So this is a very brief insight in what I do with managers. Of course, there are a lot of discussions involved and so on. recommendation to go from maximum room of maneuver to individual orientation of what to do on a particular day. Now, very briefly, I'd like to mention, I'm sure you all know that, or you all see it, you're experts, but just that we have a common understanding here. What are the cybernetic principles I've applied in this type of management workshop on vision and mission? It's about decision, and I applied two models of decision. One is the classic selection process. I give an example here. You define the problem, you give a specification or some criteria, what does a solution need to fulfill? You analyze the problem, and then in 4 and 5 are the crucial parts. In 4, I make, for example, a brainstorming, I choose possible solutions, and in step 5, I select the best one, and then I try to implement it. So this is a selection process, what to do. Besides, quite often forgotten, I have a more cybernetic decision process, which is excluding what not to do. And I try to explain it like this. In the beginning, you have the entire world as option, and then I cut off pieces. The major part I cut off, and I look only at the smaller part. And from the smaller part, I cut off more pieces until a single piece remains. And usually in cybernetics, we say it's something that can organize itself if possible. And only then I look at this small part, and if it's still required to do a further decision process, I try to choose. Sometimes it's not even necessary anymore. So this is the cybernetic principle behind. For the expert I'm talking to in this conference, it's obvious we talk about variety engineering application, and this cryptic thing at the bottom right talks to all those who know the viable system model. But as I said, I did not mention these deeper principles in the recommendation I made to the managers. And in the last part of my presentation, I like briefly to comment on why I didn't mention these cybernetic terms. What I assume is cybernetics is a fundamental innovation, and there are some theories how fundamental innovations get into the world. A very similar concept we've seen yesterday in Martin's presentation. I choose here one that is slightly different, but very strongly related. It's Geoffrey Moore's cycle from innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. Most of you may know that. And what we can say now that is cybernetics for technical systems, it has already been broadly adopted. I think it's at least, it has arrived at the late majority, maybe even further on. If you think, for example, to Google Maps, it's a very nice technical cybernetic application, which includes satellites and users and smartphones and feedback loops and everything. A magnificent technical solution. If you look to social systems, my assumption is we're at this red dot there. So the adoption in social systems, in particularly when we talk about management cybernetics, is stuck in this chasm of Geoffrey Moore. And the big questions, if we really want to answer this question I posed in the beginning, what do we need to do in order to broaden this adoption? We should somehow reach this early majority. And the theory, at least if you think it's it's a bit useful, this theory of Geoffrey Moore. It suggests that the early majority, they respond to something qualitatively different than the innovators and the early adopters, which I think we still belong to the early adopters to some extent. And while we are maybe fascinated by cybernetics, we ask some ethical questions, some maybe just think, wow, this is cool. The early majority adopts cybernetics because it works. It's useful to them, and not once in the future, but now. And it keeps them ahead of others, in particular ahead of the late majority. Think to Google Maps again. Maybe when you first started to use this application and you showed it to people who didn't already know what that is and how useful it is, it kept you ahead and it motivated you. You were an expert among your friends. You were able to show them how they can use Google Maps for their benefits. Something like that. This is the assumption, also happens with management cybernetic. And a bit more in detail, if I say, what did the innovators do? They worked with differential equations and set theory, etc. Then it went to early adopters, which I think it's in a maybe a bit a fuzzy way, us. We talk about transducers, we talk about variety engineering. My observation with decision makers, they're not interested in transducers and in variety engineering. At most, we may talk about feedback loops. That's maybe to be discussed. In a more everyday sense, this is a term they know. If you get a bit more precise, there is a lot to feedback loops that is too much for the typical managers. What they like is tools. They may like apps. And they like just to say, oh, look how smoothly it works. After the nice presentation of Toolmini we've had yesterday, I added the clowns here. This seems to me something I may be personally a bit rather on the cognitive side. I like a lot this idea of clouds to transmit cybernetic ideas to people who don't want to talk about cybernetics, really. And to conclude, this is an idea I have, or it's rather a conviction a little bit. What should we really do? I think we should invest ourselves to get to an explicit 3-tier expert model, I call that. And it's something we find in other domains that are very complicated and that are in a way too difficult, but also necessary to be used in management. We have statistics, we have law, we have IT. We can also take the example of cars. We all drive a car. We don't really understand how it works. So we have users. They don't care about the deeper principles that are behind. They just want that it works simple without any real theory behind. Then we have experts. They studied statistics, they studied law. They are able to help the users to get the results. And on the third level, you have some gurus who really go into the deep details. I don't say nobody anymore should work with differential equations and set theory, but it's definitely not the thing a large group of people needs to do. And if we succeed to get such a 3-tier expert model, I think that could help to broaden the adoption of management cybernetics, at least until the early majority. That's it. I would give back to the moderator, to Paolo. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much. Excellent session and well kept to time. Much appreciated. Thank you very much, Markus.
You're welcome.
I am going to turn to Benjamin for a question. Benjamin is a very interesting person, very highly networked amongst management consultants and organizations and so on, works a lot with civil government and so on in Britain. Very active in various systems communities and cybernetic communities and so on. And he asked a very interesting question, or made a comment, and I'd like him to turn it into a question, arising about meaning arising in contextual use versus definitions. And he contextualized it by a wonderful quotation from Winograd and Flores. Over to you, Benjamin. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you for putting me on the spot there. That's hi everybody. Yeah, and I should say I got that quote from Patrick Hoverstadt when we were talking about the challenge of defining autopoiesis specifically, which is one of those words that you probably don't want to use in a 20-minute management presentation. So in all of the really good chat which was inspired by this conversation, we were talking about how you, I think Ben Sweeting's point about a conversation turns in Pasque on a difference between understandings, and we sort of, we need new language to describe new concepts, but we need familiar language to make people comfortable. So my point was that the way I deal with that dilemma, yeah.
Turn it into a question.
Okay, Angus.
Sorry to be a boss.
Okay, so do you have a preference or a pattern between offering definitions of new words or letting the meaning emerge in the contextual use?
Markus.
Yeah, I was just looking at the comments I got, and I think, I mean, the whole terminology, if I understood the question well, this plays a big role in the thing. If we can translate what we do in management cybernetics into more everyday terms, I think this is useful, and I see that this is something the experts would do for the users, as I call them. This is one service the experts, you can call it a didactical service to make complicated terms understandable for managers. And I don't think it's completely forbidden. I wouldn't promote that as a dogma to use, for example, a term like a variety. That's I think it should be discussed. Do we really use this term? But a few we may need to use, but whenever possible to map these terms to a simple or an everyday terms they already know, we should do it. I don't know if this answers your question, Benjamin.
I think it really does answer my question about your approach. I guess it's tricky, isn't it? I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that being close to, you know, expert sages creating lies to children to put concepts into people's own worlds. But I can see that that's sometimes absolutely necessary. I suppose it depends on the context and the journey that you and your clients are going on. I imagine over time that would fall away if you're working with people over an extended period of time and they would start to grasp the more technical concepts, even if it's in their own phrasing.
The point is that just working over time with them, that requires that they really stay with us over time. And if you really work with managers, and I mean, these are poor guys in a way, you can say they're under a lot of pressure. They suffer from this pressure, but they need to bring their results, financial results. They are under pressure from their own people, and I perceive them as extremely impatient. And if they feel that you you bring them too much theory, they lose interest.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that needs to be taken into account. A few you may lose, but you still like to keep a few interested. And for that we need to focus more on their immediate utility they have from this type of concepts. And this is just my opinion. You can have a different opinion, but I think there is a huge potential we can still exploit.
Thank you, Markus. Yes, in my own experience, if you can get the concept really clear, then you can use in any language that works in a situation if the concept is clear. And sometimes you can use the technically right language and the concept is quite unclear. Thank you very much, Markus.